collaborative work among members on climate change. Our activity lines: knowledge sharing, capacity building, access to international climate finance.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this side event, which is happening at the very right time. Yesterday, as you all know, we had a Nature Day, and the discussion that was happening was putting nature at the center of the conversation at the Climate COP, which is very, very important. Catalyzing financing for nature-based solution event this morning will focus on looking at public development banks and what is their role in catalyzing action at scale to achieve impacts on the ground, specifically to address climate change, biodiversity loss, but also other development goals that we all know. Nature-based solutions are actions to protect natural ecosystems that benefit people, whilst contributing to tackling climate change and protecting biodiversity. While interest is increasing globally in the potential of MDBs, both from public sector, private sector, but also communities, there is still a gap in the financing these solutions, regardless of most of us knowing that they have huge potential. There's a need to triple investment in nature-based solution, considering that only about 133 billion today are invested in nature-based solutions out of quite a lot of needs that is there. We are only talking about less than 30% of available financing, so the gap is still big. The event this morning will focus on understanding and discussing the role of multilateral development banks in catalyzing action. We all know that this financing would not just come from public financing. We need the role of private sector, but also other type of instruments if you want to achieve the goals of keeping this or reducing the warming that we are going through today. We have very interesting panel and of experts, but also we are hoping to have a government representative who will share with us not only about the demand of financing, but also will speak very loudly about the opportunity that we have to scale up these actions and create impact with the communities. Without further ado, I would like to start by calling our colleagues who is online, Mandy Belnet. Mandy Belnet works for the South Africa National Biodiversity Institute and is the Chief Director of Climate Change Adaptation. And he will share with us what does nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation action on the ground looks like. And after that, we will dive deeper into our second session of the panel.
Great, good morning.
Okay,
good morning, colleagues. Can you hear me well? Is it good?
We can hear you loud and clear. Please go ahead.
Okay, wonderful. I actually was in at the COP until Friday. I left to come back to South Africa yesterday. So I can imagine where you're all sitting. I'm very sorry I can't be with you. Thanks very much for the introduction. I work for the South African National Biodiversity Institute, and we're an entity of the National Environment Department in South Africa. We're also a direct access entity of the Green Climate Fund and the Adaptation Fund. And what that means is that we work from a content point of view at the interface between science, policy, and implementation, and from a technical point of view at the nexus of biodiversity and climate change and finance as well. So we've got quite a lot of experience under our belt working into the space of, in South Africa, we prefer the term ecosystem-based adaptation. And I'm very happy to share with you today some of the tangible examples that we're working with. And I'll talk a little bit into where I think the gaps are and the barriers that stop us from scaling the work and entering into proper or robust and scaled partnerships with the public development banks. Okay, so starting off, if we can go to the next slide, please. I'm not sure. There we go. Next slide, please. No, I'm having a little bit of a technical problem my side. All right, there we go. Okay, so I've gone over this. This is just a little bit about the background of SANBI and how we're perfectly positioned to champion ecosystem-based adaptation in our efforts to secure climate finance. And especially the place that we work in is grant finance from the Adaptation Fund and the Green Climate Fund. But I think critical here is for us to look at how that grant finance can be a platform towards scaling up using different financial instruments. So just quickly flashing up on the screen, the way we understand ecosystem-based adaptation is drawing on the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity definition. You can see the Venn diagram on the left-hand side, and essentially we're saying that ecosystem-based adaptation is where we have this nexus between climate change adaptation, biodiversity and ecosystem conservation, social and economic benefits, and all within the context of sustainable development. So our specific journey in the space of unlocking climate finance for this work began with the Adaptation Fund. SANBI was accredited with the Adaptation Fund back in 2011, and we implemented a couple of projects. And the one I'll talk about today briefly was a project in one of our rural areas just inland from Durban. Some of you might have been there for COP 11, I think, no, COP 17 in 2011. This is, as I said, a rural area. It's under traditional land management. And we came in with a $7.5 million adaptation fund project that had a couple of components to it. So you can see the bullets on the screen. We worked with early warning systems. We worked with smallholder farmers in the agricultural space. And very importantly, in the second bullet, which is where I'll come in emphasizing today, we worked with built and ecological infrastructure. And crucially here, just to show that we're already here, we're proposing that we're using ecosystem-based adaptation as part of an integrated response. So it's very important for our scaling and for us being able to deliver multi-beneficial projects on the ground. So this is where we are. If I take you just on a little tour quickly, I don't know who's in the audience today. I can't imagine that many of you have been to South Africa. This is what it looks like where we're working. In these rural areas, this particular site. It's very hilly. You can see the homesteads are interspersed in quite widely across the landscape. On the top left-hand side, you can see an example of a homestead, and you can see the erosion around the sides of it from the heavy rain. And you can see with the climate projections in this part of the world, which is more heavy rain, how those structures are potentially going to be further eroded. In the middle photograph, you can see cattle alongside a river. Typically what happens in this part of the world is that the rivers flood. There's no warning for the communities and the assets get destroyed. And on the bottom photograph, you can see another homestead. You can see an agricultural smallholder farm below that homestead. And what you can see is bush encroachment. And this causes other problems because what happens is we have bush pigs that come in and they eat the produce and they impact on food security. So very importantly in this project, we start off, and you've heard already in the way I'm talking, we start off with the climate projections. In this part of the world, what we know is that the temperatures are increasing. We're likely to have increased storm and flood events. And we're likely to see, or we're already seeing, seasonal shifts, which means that the rains that would typically have come at very defined parts of the year are no longer coming then. It means that the cattle are feeding for longer on the grasslands. They're eating the vegetation even lower down. It means when the rains do come, what we start to see is erosion. So you can see there are the impacts. Drowning and flash floods. The local communities don't know that it's raining over the hills. and the flood waters come. There's lightning, so homesteads like the one on the top left are very prone to things like that. Bush pigs, I mentioned already, wildfires, water scarcity. And so when we design these projects, we start off working in a bottom-up way, engaging with the local communities and saying, well, how would you like to respond? And in our engagements, what the community said is that they'd like to do things like responding to bush encroachment and the increasing wildfires by tackling the bush encroachment that involves quite a lot of invasive alien clearing, removing the invasive alien plants like the bush also reduces the risk of wildfires and helps to deal with food security. So showing you some examples of the kinds of interventions that we work with. I'm not sure what my next, oh, there we go. So these are some of the interventions that we're working with in this ecosystem-based adaptation project: rehabilitation of grasslands to improve grazing capacity, working with farming communities to help them see that if the cattle graze too close to where the river corridors are, we have further erosion and further then downstream impacts when the increased storm and flood events come. Working with communities to understand the linkages between healthy ecosystems and flood attenuation. So the idea being that if the ecosystems are functioning well, they'll slow down the flood and storm water, and they'll also promote groundwater recharge, which of course plays into water security. Okay, so that just gives you a little snapshot of what we've been doing in this one adaptation fund project. And what I'm trying to give, especially those of you that come from a financial background, a flavor of is the granularity of the responses, how they respond to the local environments where we're working, and to start giving you a sort of colored in picture of what ecosystem-based adaptation looks like in a receiving environment like this, in a rural area where you've got lots of people that are vulnerable to climate change because of pre-existing vulnerabilities, and the kinds of work that we're trying to do to move into these areas. So what SANBI is busy with now, this project is closing out, it's been very successful, is we're developing a portfolio of Green Climate Fund proposals that all work into this ecosystem-based adaptation space. And I won't spend much time on this. I just want to give you a flavor to show you what is coming in the South Africa portfolio for the GCF. Project 1, we call it our Eco-DRR project. It's the slide on the bottom left. It has a grant request of $30 million, and it's working with floods and droughts in rural areas very similar to the one you saw in the images of the Umgeni Resilience Project, very much looking at how we do investments in built infrastructure and ecological infrastructure to complement each other. And you can see the photograph on the bottom right of that slide, where you've got some people that are benefiting from job creation, that are creating gabions or kind of rocks inside of wire structures in the wetland area, helping to create structure in those wetlands and stop the erosion that happens, and that will be exacerbated with these increased storm-induced or climate change exacerbated storm events. Many beneficiaries, more than 200,000, lots of job creation. And so the opportunity for us to do not only climate change adaptation responses, but talk into the very important social and economic priorities of the country, which are about addressing in South Africa, employment and especially youth unemployment. Second project looks at ecosystem-based adaptation for smallholder farmers, once again playing into a landscape approach and working with smallholder farmers, of which there are many in our rural areas, towards smallholder agricultural systems that are developed in a landscape approach, being mindful of what's happening in the bigger landscape and what that means for farming. And then what we think will be our flagship project, it's an ecosystem-based adaptation for water security project, where we're working into, in South Africa, we call them strategic water source areas. I know in many other countries they're called water towers. Essentially, 60% of the water in South Africa comes from 10% of the land. And this project is about looking at how do we secure and better manage these areas so that they continue to produce water in a water scarce world. And of course, that project then links to a project which is about getting that very water into taps and getting it into homes. But critically in the ecosystem-based adaptation space is looking at where does the water come from in the first place. So, colleagues, if I just go to the last slide and talk a little bit about the obstacles and the financing needs, you can see them on your screen. So the first one, very importantly, is about the climate projections. In the case of ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions, we need to make sure that what we're doing is, in fact, responding to climate change, if it's a climate change context, not just, it's been said, old wine in new bottles, business as usual. But critically for this, we need the projections to be provided in very easy tools so people can use them. And I think that's a big barrier and a big opportunity. Climate change adaptation is very granular, and we need to be providing practitioners and those designing investment interventions with climate science in a very easy way. And the same would go for the technical responses. You know, how do you design a restoration project in a strategic water source area? And do we expect the banks to know that? So not necessarily. And of course, what that throws up is the need for partnerships and the need for us to better understand the way each other design and talk and put these kinds of projects together. Second bullet, just critically, social equity and a focus on the most vulnerable must be considered. It's very important for SANBI in the grant-based space, but it's very important generally for the UNFCCC obligations and commitments to really talk to those that are most impacted by climate change. The third bullet here, very importantly, and this is a little bit of a suspicion around nature-based solutions, we must be sure that these are extra, they're not instead of. So we would not like to see the private sector investing in nature-based solutions instead of the very important mitigation action that's needed. We must make sure that these interventions produce net gains for the environment. So we don't want to be planting trees in a place where they're not supposed to be. And we don't want to oversell ecosystem-based adaptation approaches. We'll more than likely always need built infrastructure interventions to complement what we're doing with nature. And then, of course, that follows to the next bullet. So I've said the investments in ecological infrastructure can complement other climate change adaptation responses. And we need to demonstrate at scale in order for this to work. So I think one of the things that's missing in the nature-based solution or ecosystem-based adaptation space in climate change is this demonstration at scale. And I think that when we start to see some of these big projects under our belts, we'll be better able to make the case for other kinds of finance to come in. And of course, that's very interesting in terms of the way the grant finance can de-risk the other forms of finance in providing these proof of concept examples. And then finally, excuse the typo on that last bullet, but I think crucially is the need for more spaces where we can have technical and financial professionals collaborating. I've spent a lot of time at this COP going to various events on nature-based solutions with the private sector, and it's clear that the languages that are used are still sometimes missing each other. And, you know, I'd like to see much more interventions where we're starting, like this session is really doing, where we're starting to bring together the biodiversity, conservation, ecological infrastructure, even climate science professionals and practitioners, together with the bankers who are obviously much more able to look at how we scale this finance into other financial instruments and crowd in, for example, private sector, but bring us together so that we can co-develop solutions and really start implementing this at scale with the kinds of benefits that we'd all like to see. Thanks very much, colleagues.
Thank you very much, Mindy. And I wanted to kindly request if you can stay online. We will absolutely come back to you during the second session as part of the panel, but also there may be a question online which you may need to respond to. I just wanted to remind that this event is streamlined on the YouTube channel of the Pavilion. So we will absolutely check the online participants as well. So if you are online and you have a question, please feel free to send it. We would also consider that. I think this is quite a very informative starting point from Mandy sharing this field experience of how either demonstration or scale of nature-based solutions or ecosystem-based adaptation. Great to remind us that it's not either or. Nature-based solutions as an umbrella term of quite many concepts including EBN, EcoDRR, and others. And the key one is what Manny mentioned. It has still to address a problem, a climate or a society challenge. It has to have a net gain of environment or biodiversity, and then it has to be scalable. So the next part of this conversation is going to be a panel, and I wanted to invite my panelists to take the seats in front. I want to invite Marie, please join us. I will introduce you in a minute. Anuj Mehta, Siloshin, and we still have, of course, Mandy online. We hope Peter Odiengo, who represents the Kenyan government, will also be able to join us in a minute. But even before he joins, I think we can still go ahead. We have already had a very good context-specific experience from Sambi, from South Africa, on this question of nature-based solution. And we are talking about getting more financing to scale, but also to do more, still remembering that nature-based solutions are not a substitute to other climate mitigation actions. And this needs to be rapidly done as well. So we are privileged to have on the panel Marie, who is the Deputy Executive Secretary of AFD, Agence Française de Développement, and have experience and have worked across a range of things within AFD, but more specifically focusing on sustainable development, which is a very critical element of this particular conversation. And Marie, I just want to come to you with a question, just if you can share about the AFD strategy, especially on nature-based solution, and more specifically, if you could provide and share examples of how AFD have been financing and investing in nature-based solutions to address society challenges. Over to you.
I stay here or
You can.
Okay. Thank you very much, Charles, and good morning. Thank you very much for inviting us to this panel. Actually, I have 3 points and one video. My first point is about AFD's commitment towards climate and biodiversity. As you know, IUCN estimates that nature-based solutions could provide 30% of climate mitigation required by 2030 in order to stabilize warming below 2. And in the same way, natural ecosystems contribute to the majority of solutions for adaptation. But in spite of these evidences, NBS are still underfunded. In order to bridge this gap, AFD has defined some ambitious objectives. The first one is to double the group's direct contribution to biodiversity from $500 million in 2020 to $1 billion by 2025 through the mainstreaming of biodiversity in all sectors. And today I can see that the group is very well on track to meet this goal. In 2022, biodiversity finance reached 736 million, which is an increase of 24% regarding 2021. The second objective of our group is to dedicate 30% of climate finance committed each year to projects that also benefit biodiversity to enhance convergence between climate and biodiversity financing. And the objective is already reached in 2021 with 2 billion euros. I also would like to underline that even before the adoption of AFD's climate biodiversity convergence objective, AFD was already deeply involved in projects with nature-based solutions. Indeed, in 2022, we supported 18 projects with an NBS component, especially in water management, sustainable agriculture, and urban development. But there is still a need to scale up this financing, and that's why AFD would like to promote NBS in its new climate and nature roadmap currently under discussion. This means three things. First, recognizing that NBS are important levers to mainstream biodiversity and tackle simultaneously the climate and the biodiversity crisis, and also contributing to the alignment to Paris Agreement and the GBF. Second, promoting and scaling up NBS in its operation, especially through adoption of guidelines and good practices to operationalize NBS. And third, improving monitoring and reporting on NBS projects. In this perspective, AFD encourages all DFIs to mainstream NBS in all sectors. My second part is about examples, and I would like to give you two examples illustrating the coordination between stakeholders and innovative approach to develop NBS projects. So my first example is a video, and it concerns the Indian Ocean. I let you see on the screen. I hope it works.
Les îles de Madagascar, des Comores, de Maurice et des Seychelles sont des territoires parmi les plus vulnérables aux impacts du changement climatique. Les populations, les terres agricoles et les infrastructures sont concentrées dans les zones côtières, fortement exposées à ces impacts.
80% de la population comorienne sont des agriculteurs et des pêcheurs. Le changement climatique impacte fortement leur mode de vie. Les agriculteurs parlent souvent des problèmes de sécheresse aiguë, du dérèglement des saisons agricoles et l'apparition de nouvelles maladies. Les pêcheurs, de leur côté, parlent de la mortalité aiguë des coraux et une régénération très lente de récifs.
Dans ces territoires, la protection de la biodiversité apporte pourtant des solutions d'adaptation à l'évolution du climat. Garantir la santé des écosystèmes, comme les mangroves, les forêts ou les zones humides, est au cœur de la résilience des îles et de ses habitants. Créé en 2000, à l'initiative de plusieurs organisations et soutenu par l'AFD depuis 2007, le CEPF a pour objectif la conservation des écosystèmes vitaux dans les hotspots de biodiversité du monde à travers le renforcement des capacités de la société civile.
Donc le CEPF va mettre des financements disponibles à l'endroit de la société civile de ces 4 pays de l'océan Indien. Et donc ces ONG vont travailler avec les populations locales pour développer des projets destinés à gérer les écosystèmes, les restaurer ou promouvoir une agriculture qui soit plus adaptée aux conditions climatiques d'aujourd'hui. Donc les populations locales seront non seulement les acteurs, mais aussi les bénéficiaires de ces projets qui seront encadrés par des ONG, la plupart locales.
Pour soutenir l'adaptation des populations locales au changement climatique, DARI cible d'ici fin 2027 la conservation et la restauration d'un tiers de la forêt de l'île d'Anjouan et 750 hectares de récifs de l'île. Ces programmes permettront à 50 000 personnes d'obtenir des moyens de subsistance plus durables et plus sûrs.
Ce programme soutient ainsi la mise en œuvre des solutions fondées sur la nature pour le climat, en lien avec les engagements pris par les pays lors de la COP15 biodiversité. Entre autres, il permettra de protéger et mieux gérer 1,23 million d'hectares d'écosystèmes côtiers et 0,6 million d'hectares d'écosystèmes forestiers de bassins versants, et d'accroître les revenus de 33 000 femmes et 33 000 hommes grâce à des activités de subsistance fondées sur les écosystèmes.
Thank you. So this was my first example. And the second example is called the Kiwa Initiative. It's a multiple donor program that responds to the cross-cutting issues of biodiversity conservation and adaptation to climate change for resilient development and livelihood enhancement communities in island in the Pacific. We all know the situation of this Pacific island, and in this context, AFD managed the Kiwa initiative and participate in its financing together with the European Union, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia, and in partnership with EUCN, Pacific Community, and the Secretariat of the Pacific Regional Environment Programme. This initiative, Kiwa initiative, aims to strengthen the resilience of Pacific countries by setting up a dedicated one-stop shop for funding projects that promote NBS through a call of projects. So far, 18 local projects and 5 regional projects covering 16 Pacific Island countries and territories are ongoing and will support conservation and restoration of terrestrial, coastal, and marine ecosystems. We believe that these two initiatives, these two examples are very good examples of what can be achieved while we mutualize forces between donors and with technical partners such as EUCN. My third and last point is about scaling up NBS. We believe that it is absolutely necessary to enhance cooperation and coordination and to coordinate action between stakeholders to scale up these initiatives. That's why we are also supporting an initiative from IDFC on NBS financing for adaptation to climate change. And this initiative is under development and developed in partnership with IUCN. I also would like to underline that we announced earlier this week, actually I don't remember if it was on Sunday or Monday, but it was earlier, an initiative that will join the NBS Finance Hub initiative for Asia and Pacific, launched by the Asian Development Bank. And to conclude, I would like to say that the development of these initiatives show the growing interest in NBS. And we believe that it's by mutualizing our efforts through the identification and support for the feasibility of innovative projects, the development of new approaches, the capitalization and capacity building that we can mobilize government, local authorities, and communities to developing these solutions. Thank you.
No, this is super inspiring, and it sounds the music in my ears when I hear these big commitments and dedication to absolutely scale, but also innovatively build this collaboration that can see nature-based solutions implemented. Our second speaker is Anuj. Anuj works for the Asia Development Bank. I'm glad to meet him in person. You are the country director and the Thailand resident representative of the Asia Development Bank, but also we know you have been the mastermind of the nature solution facility that we launched on the 3rd of this month, and thanks to the commitment of AFD to join that. We have heard already from Mendy, and we have heard from Marie. They talked about all these initiatives in different countries that are being really transforming, actually, impacting positively the communities, addressing the sea level rise. We talked about addressing livelihoods of communities, stopping soil erosions, just to name a few. But also, both of them mentioned the question of scale. And when we start talking about scale, we are talking about investment. We are talking about not hundreds of thousands of dollars. We are talking about millions and the billions. And probably this question is to you, what are the opportunities you see from ADB view on scaling up these nature-based solutions? But not only opportunities, but also based on your experience and engagement so far, what would be the partnership required to make this happen? No, you can come here or you can speak from there. You have a mic on this side.
Thank you very much, firstly, for having me here. Great to be here. And, and since I'm a finance person, I'm the head of ADB's office in Thailand and also helping ADB develop the Nature Solutions Finance Hub with partners. Before I come to that, because we'll easily get lost in numbers and instruments and all those cool things. But so I live in Bangkok for the ADB office, and we've got a province in the north of Thailand called Nan province. Went there about 3-4 months ago, and one of the biggest issues is that most of the farmers over there produce rice. It's a big part of Thailand's exports. Huge impact of climate change. Huge impact in terms of their ability to produce rice. So they're actually now thinking of stopping rice production, going to avocado and going to cocoa. And when you go and see those small farms and farmers, you really get a sense of what's actually happening, what could be done to implement solutions which are simple and could adapt to some of the changes that are coming from climate, but the financing is missing. So it makes it super clear. And then you come from there back to Bangkok, which is a rather large city compared to the province in the north, which has got a lot of people, and it's suffering from a lot of issues from climate change, especially flooding. So you've got a lot of issues in terms of sea level rise, groundwater, which is being extracted, and therefore it's slightly sinking. So, the issues are real. The answers come from nature-based solutions, and therefore there's a lot of thought going on about how to integrate nature into climate heavily. So let me come down to 3 levels, just to sort of make it a little clear, and then come back in terms of, sort of the first level, which is corporate. So what's ADB doing? And let me just for a second talk about that. Just big picture, ADB's climate ambition for 2030 is to basically support 100 billion in cumulative financing for climate. Out of that, we estimate about 25 billion can be used for nature outputs or nature positive outputs. And that includes 4 areas. So oceans, there's a lot of work which is going on healthy oceans. We think 11 billion or so will go into oceans. Second is agri-food systems transformations, the value chains, examples like I just mentioned. We think about 9 to 10 billion of our funding will go for that. Flyways, which is basically conservation of species, we think about 3 billion for that, and other nature-based solutions about 2 billion. So we are saying roughly 25 billion from ADB could go into nature-positive solutions by 2030. Now, the issue is the scale, because if you now look at the requirement, it's 700 billion annually. It's, if you just look at Southeast Asia, just for infrastructure there, I think it's 210 billion annually. So the numbers are so massive. The question is, how do you scale up? And you're struck by what both the previous speakers said, and especially some of the examples in South Africa. A number of grant projects which are being used to develop some of those projects. And I think, sort of Mandy, I think, mentioned also how can we use those grants to leverage more capital. So, my approach to this is always to start off by saying, can $8 of development finance from all the development agencies, whether us, the AFD, the governments, can it leverage $3 to $4 from private sector? Now that's a bank, a bond, a PPP, doesn't matter. Then we start having impact. How do we leverage? How do we build those, that sort of a target? So we've launched this Nature Solutions Finance Hub on just this week. And there the aim is to help countries in figuring out the challenges to achieving that goal. $1 of development aid to leverage $3 to $4 from private sector. So we are saying roughly about $1 billion is about the fund that we're putting together with the partners. Can that lead to at least $3 or $4 billion worth of projects in the next 7 years? How do we do it? And so the approach that we are putting in place and is built on some examples which I'll also mention is based on developing certainly the capacities of, and I see even on the IDFC board over here, a number of national development banks, your PDBs or MDBs, I think as they're called. So improve capacities of domestic financial institutions and of governments. I think that's number one. In terms of how to use finance innovatively. Number two is instruments, which let me talk about in a second. And third is de-risking. Now, the instruments, I think the way of scaling up finance into countries is by using instruments which can attract a lot of funding from the private sector. Bonds is number one. So, and of course, every instrument will have a different applicability. We've been working on green bonds, for example, in Thailand and in Indonesia, many other countries. But since I'm in Thailand, you know, in the last few years, 3 years, I've seen just the work we've supported with the Thai government. Sustainability bonds, social bonds, green bonds, has raised something like about $2 billion in 3 years with a very little support from us. It's a stark reminder of how much you can raise using bonds if they're well structured. Number two is blending. So this is where we can make finance more affordable for entities by blending concessional finance with more expensive commercial finance, maybe one of the easier things to do in financial instruments. And number three is credits. Now, you know, there's a lot of discussion about credits. And the way, you know, sort of I look at it is to develop annual revenue streams for projects which don't have direct revenue streams. Which, of course, there's a lot of science which goes behind it in terms of how do you value the benefit of, you know, the water absorption that Mandy was talking about for those hillsides, right? How do you value the loss of produce? So there's a lot of science behind it, but the basic essence of it is, can you create what looks like a revenue stream annually for a project, therefore making it financially attractive to someone else to put in money, a bank to the small farmers, for example. So credits is going to be a very important aspect in terms of scaling up finance into nature-based solutions, but it needs work, and a lot of people are working on it. Which brings me to my third point, which is a de-risking fund. Even if we develop a bond instrument, as we've been doing in some places, or a biodiversity credits mechanism, there is still a period, let's say the next 6-7 years, when these credits or the bonds will have a little bit of a question mark on the end revenue lines of those projects. So you need a transition finance for nature-based solutions in the interim. So the de-risking fund that we're putting together with all our partners, AFD, OPEC Fund, the Saudi Fund, and ACGF, the ASEAN Green Facility, aims to say that before the revenues actually happen from either a real revenue or from a sale of a credit, can we provide transition finance in 6-7 years, which could be for blending, it could be for supporting the credits or a guarantee. That's basically what we are working on using our nature-based solutions financing hub. There are good examples of this already, which we've worked on with the ASEAN Catalytic Green Facility. And you know, there are projects in Indonesia. I always love to talk about SDG Indonesia 1 because it is one of the first green finance facilities that we put in place with PTSMI, one of the members of IDFC here. And that one takes this idea that we put in over a few years 600 million. It starts with a 150 million loan from ADB. And then that basically leverages 5 or 6 times finance from other sources to green infrastructure. And if we can do it for Indonesia, for green infrastructure, that's basically the model that we want to use for others for nature-based solutions. The models will have to be a little bit tighter. There'll have to be a little bit more concessionality. And there'll have to be a lot more hand-holding for developing the underlying projects. And I think that's the way, if I can put it in a few minutes together, the story of scaling up would happen. So, summing up, it would be scale 1 to 3, 1 to 6, ideally, using development finance. The tools for that would be capacities locally, demonstration projects, de-risking fund, very important, and the development of 2 or 3 instruments which can be shown to work. And there are examples which we are already discussing with the Nature Conservancy, with Inter-American Development Bank, who've put in place nice ideas from places like Uruguay. There's a nice bond structure there, tiger bonds, rhino bonds. So these structures, can we apply them in the Asia-Pacific region? So I think that's the approach we have. We start planning for the implementation of the Nature Solutions Hub now, immediately. And we are hoping that some of the projects which you've already identified now will not just be financed, but will be innovatively financed using public and private finance. And you'll start seeing examples of this even from next year. So I hope that gives a bit of an overview. I'll stop over there.
I think that's extremely helpful, Anuj. Thank you very much. I picked a couple of points, but let me not come back to that now, because you mentioned development finance and how that can actually leverage private sector. And the good thing is we have already one of the speakers who works for exactly Development Bank of South Africa. Siloshin, you are the head of ESG at the DBSA Bank, and we'll be absolutely happy to hear your perspective on that. But more importantly, sharing how is the bank driving that leverage as well from private sector to scale up these nature-based solutions. But if also you could speak about what is the overall DBSA strategy on this question of ecosystem-based adaptation and nature-based solutions. You can either join here because I know you have also a slide. And you can also stay there. It's open.
Thank you. Okay, let me just sit here. Thank you for the opportunity in having a quick discussion on this very important point. I think some of my colleagues have already spoken about some of the important points, especially working very closely with Bandy, with Sanbi. We've already undertaken to work with her in a partnership through Jeff, our partnership, and we acted as implementing agency, specifically at the project that she mentioned, which is the biodiversity for water security. So I really like the points. I just want to also give you an idea that a few years ago, the South African financial sector as a general was, had very little appetite to talk about nature-based solutions. So it's not a completely novel concept, nature-based solutions. I mean, we've been talking about natural capital for a very long time, and it's great to see that the traction has moved in the financial sector over the last, I think, 2 to 3 years specifically. And so one of the projects that or initiatives we're actually working to around, and I just want to talk about it because we just spoke about it now through Anuj. We're working with the Rand Merchant Bank on a biodiversity credit program, which involves a suite of projects that have a high biodiversity credit potential. So the other aspect I want to just touch on is it's very encouraging as well. We need to look at what real sector is doing. Obviously, we influence through our clients, right? And so it's very encouraging to look at clients specifically in the oil and gas sector that have taken on board all of these nature-based solutions and them actually committing to actually request for support in terms of instruments. I mean, we can only respond to demand from our clients. And when clients start to ask us questions about, what's your product offerings on, this is what we're doing. We're doing a blue carbon project. And blue carbon projects are extremely important when you're looking at sequestration, biodiversity and climate being very interrelated. So clients asking us questions about linked loans, clients asking us questions about transition finance type instruments. So that's been very encouraging. And so on that basis, the financial sector needs to actually take this on board and start to really drive the scale. So I think for me, that's been important for us to test the market. We are there now, and so it's important for us to leverage this, and hopefully post-COP, we can continue that traction. So I just want to quickly talk about as well what the DBSA has actually been doing to date. I did mention to various colleagues over these past few days our commitment to really take on board the TCFD reporting framework. as a public bank, it's not always been easy, to move the dial and get alignment on international best practice. I mean, MDBs have been doing it a lot more. They are our strategic partners. I've also emphasized consistency has been very important for our partnerships. And so that becomes important. But then we've also started to build up traction on TNFD. So in terms of TNFD, some of the work that we've really started in 2019 we started a dependency analysis. We actually work with strategic partners in that respect. So we worked with the likes of Oliver Wyman. It was almost a 3-4 year piece of work where we really started to look at biodiversity and water risks. Obviously, you can't really decouple climate, biodiversity, and water, specifically the jurisdictions in which we operate in, being very water scarce. And then how do you actually couple that with food security and agricultural practices, sustainable livelihoods? And so on that basis, we really started applying our mind. We do understand a level of risk now on our portfolio. We haven't really started to set, we're debating targets at this point in time. However, me starting at the DBSA only in Jan of this year, and I was in the commercial banking space for a bit of time, I know that this has been quite a big step, for the DBSA in terms of it being a public bank and then trying to actually push this forward. So target setting the discussions have been very encouraging internally. However, much more complicated, as you know, and so therefore we are proceeding with caution in terms of some of those targets. We have set an overall target that we hope to be biodiversity positive by 2030, which means that obviously we need to ensure that we step up the game. And so through the likes of working with partners like SANBI and so forth, we hope to do that. So really, DBSA has been quite progressive, I must say, in this space. My team have had a vested interest in this space. And so, we really deal with NBS in about 6 ways. One of it is obviously promotion at a policy level. DBSA being a public bank, we do need to see ourselves as policy instruments in our country. So we work a lot with government. We've been working with, the likes of National Treasury and so forth, although the focus has been largely on climate risk in the financial sector to date. Direct investment in biodiversity through GEF and GCF, as well as the Green Fund. So that's one of our other levers. Mandy already mentioned, the Biodiversity for Water Security initiative that we participated in. And then mainstreaming biodiversity through our investments. One of our projects that we're quite proud of, but obviously, if you can replicate it, obtain scale, it would be great. It's the eThekwini Aqueduct that set aside about 5% of the loan amount to promote mainstreaming biodiversity into municipal infrastructure programs. And so obviously that's a key imperative for us to try to leverage through lending in our municipal spaces, as well as working with the NGOs and communities there. So that has, been a really great model for us. And then operational commitment. So what are we doing as DBSA? So we've strategically started taking on board some of our own initiatives on our campus in terms of greening our campus and so forth. And then looking to understand, some of our campus's issues in terms of biodiversity restoration projects and so forth. And then obviously continuing to build partnerships. As I mentioned, the RMB initiative that we are very excited about. And then also continuing to explore a range of financial instruments and mechanisms. You know, we obviously lend into the SADC community, those particular regions being very vulnerable to climate change as well as biodiversity, as well as poverty issues. And so then again, the agricultural overlay comes into play. How do we deal with that? And it was so interesting, and I guess that's the beauty of COP. En route here, I actually engaged with an interesting gentleman who actually I will be probably, you know, going into a little bit more research on. But the paper is actually promoting a bit of, on the agricultural side, I think the paper is called Eco-Degradation or Regeneration, the Crucial Climate Role of Regenerative Agriculture. And it talks about seeds that actually grow in environments that have, you know, high, it has high tolerance levels to environmental variables and so forth, especially growing it in in areas of drought. And so we've got to be careful going too far to the left or to the right in terms of how we push nature-based solutions, because investing in those types of initiatives to just counter the agricultural food security aspect is also equally important. So I hope I've covered enough and give you a bit of a synopsis of where we are. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. That's very, I think listening to you, it's really inspiring, because we are seeing a transition. And I have to say, yeah, it's going absolutely to take time to get 100%, but I like the will and the courage to move towards the right direction to transition to sustainable investment, to investing in nature. And you shared a couple of very good examples of what the bank is doing. And I understand also operating in a national context is not always the easiest way to do everything at the same time. We have probably an audience online. I want to check if there is any question here in the room or online that we have received. In the next couple of minutes remaining to close this session, we would also invite Mustafa at the end just to give us, Mari mentioned the IDFC, IUCN and FD initiative that we are trying to develop to catalyze more financing flow, and he will absolutely share that at the end and a couple of takeaway message just in the last 5 minutes. But I want to come back to the panel, and I hope, Mandy, you're still online, and I will start with you. From this conversation, it's very clear that we need more resources, we need more financing to scale up nature-based solution, ecosystem-based adaptation work. It's also clear that we all understand the need. We all understand and we know the importance of this solution if you want to tackle especially climate adaptation, even if we know nature-based solutions significantly can contribute to mitigation. But I wouldn't want to get lost into saying that it's a solution to mitigation. We need absolutely to do that more, but more importantly, moving towards other mitigation transitions, mitigation actions. If you can speak about Sami's vision to leverage on private sector, because you are a very respected institution in South Africa, you have got the science, you have already the practice, you know what works, you know what needs to be scaled up, and where do you see the role of corporates in Southern Africa context, especially they are also part of the beneficiary of these ecosystem services that nature is providing. We mentioned water, food, but also other ecosystem services. I will give that to you, and we will follow up with the other speakers.
Great. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay.
Loud and
So
clear.
I think that the way I'd like to respond to this is about making a value proposition, which is around Sanbi and the likes of Sanbi partnering more in a more meaningful way with the corporates. So you heard Saloshni talking about the partnerships between Sanbi and the DBSA, and I think these kinds of partnerships help us to start making the linkages between the conversations that are happening in the banks and in the private sector, and the kinds of technical understanding that the likes of Sanbi bring to the table, but often don't explain it in a way that is digestible to the private sector. So we did a very interesting partnership with an umbrella organization that works with the private sector in South Africa called the National Biodiversity Initiative, where we worked with them with a number of corporates towards developing climate change adaptation projects. And we really struggled. We ended up working often with the corporate social investment people, not the main business people. We realized that what we think is easy in terms of understanding technical concepts is really not, because we talk very different languages. And I think that's really where I would like to talk about our vision, which is about unlocking more meaningful partnerships so that there's proper integrity to the interventions that are picked up, and then working with the private sector towards understanding the ways in which their systems work towards scaling.
Thank you very much, Mandy. And I fully agree that absolutely we need to provide more evidence, more business case to private sector to be able to invest. Marie, I think FD works quite very closely with the governments. And we know that development finance will also need to leverage quite a lot on public finance in the national context. And this question also will go to Anuj at some point. How do we create that branded finance? I'm also looking at development finance, of course, can do that much, but it's not, it should really catalyze a transformative also flow of public and domestic flow of investment into these solutions, especially where we fully know that it works. You gave an example of Thailand, you gave an example of the Comoros and Madagascar. It is still a responsibility of national finance to really also address and significantly do that. So how do we catalyze that change to also continue seeing an impact at national level?
Okay, thank you, Charles, for your question. Actually, I would like to respond with 5 main points. The first one is that we believe that we have to work together more and more. By together, I mean donors, but also governments, local authorities, civil society, scientists, and private sector, of course. So my first message is work more and more together. My second point is that we absolutely need to prove that it works on the ground. So we have to provide figures on the results, on impact on the ground, to make some evaluation, and so yes, prove that it works and that grey infrastructures are not the solution, and that we need also NBS components in projects. My third message is that we also have from a donor to provide grants to prepare projects, and also to provide technical assistance to our partners and our clients. It's very important. Regarding government and local authorities, it's also very important to work both on incentives and on regulations. So these two work together, and it's also really at the top of the agenda. And my fifth and last message is also from a donor. We have to continue to provide concessional loans, and to work also on blending with other institutions in order to provide loans and grants that are adapted to our clients, both at national level but also at local level.
Thank you. I'll pass the same question to Anuj. Your experience, if you could share. I know ADB works with with government, and you have already done quite a number of projects funding government, but also government bring their own resources to do something significant. Yesterday we saw the presentation from Professor KG, who shared about the Sponge City, and we understand some of this investment. How do we catalyze those examples more, where, of course, other type of instruments, financing instruments, can also leverage on domestic financing?
Yeah, no, excellent. And I agree with you in terms of all your points, actually. So I think number one is cooperate. So cooperate with partners. There are so many great examples from South America, South Africa, which are being done in the world of nature-based solutions and biodiversity. I think cooperate with other development partners to bring some of that. A lot of it is now being called South-South cooperation. Bring those and secondly, replicate those. There are examples like the ones I mentioned in Indonesia. There are coastal projects that we're doing in Cambodia. Why are we not doing it in every other country? So cooperate, identify good examples, whether from outside the region, my region, or within the region, and then replicate. Now, replicate, there is a change in how development finance is happening in the last, I would say, maybe 5 to 10 years versus 30, 40 years before, which is that there's a lot more ask of the development agencies to put forward ideas which we would normally in the banking world call origination or pitching. So we need to go with ideas, value additions to the governments to showcase examples technically, like Mandy was saying, and financially, like I was mentioning some of those examples, and say, here is an example which works in South Africa, here is a bond structure which could work for you in Thailand, can we now develop this? So third point would be demonstrate, which is basically develop projects which can become anchor projects for replication in that country. And last is enable. So whatever we do as development banks, putting the instruments together, putting a pilot project together, putting a fund together, eventually we can only do so much, right? We did something like 30 billion or something ADB last year in lending. Can we then create the enabling environment, a much used word, but using local institutions, local banks, local governments, and say, here is not ADB's fund, this is your fund. Can you now do 30 more projects at your level? Here's an example, it's already worked, can you do it? And I always go back to the example of India when they started their PPP program back in 2006. They created something called a viability gap fund. It was India's program, ADB supported it. It was put in place and it just expanded the amount of PPP projects that happened, run by the government themselves. So that's my fourth, I think, which is basically help enable local entities to take forward the agenda. That's how you'll multiply a lot more.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and being in IDFC Pavilion absolutely makes it more a core to do more with different banks, and that's why I said Mustafa will probably close this session with what is our takeaway and how we're going to do that. But before Mustafa, I call you, I just want to go back to you, Siloshin, because you mentioned the examples of what Development Bank in South Africa is doing. Are we doing enough, or we need to be more ambitious? If you have to be more ambitious, I saw you absolutely have a clear roadmap. How do we really accelerate that? We can't wait. Climate change is already here. We can't wait for another 2 years to really transform how financial flows are happening. I know it's not an easy job, but are we doing enough? Do we need to be more ambitious? And how do we accelerate this action to achieve our ambitious goals?
Yeah, I think definitely we need to do enough, more, a lot more. I don't think in terms of, what the Global Biodiversity Fund, what the objectives behind it is talking to, that we're exactly where we should be. I mean, I think the figure we mentioned earlier, it's about 150 million or so dollars that we've got flowing around nature-based solutions. And really, I think we would need to almost treble that to reach 2030 goals. So I definitely don't think it's enough, but it is also because of the nature of the beast. And biodiversity climate had a big focal point in these past few years. And so I think now the traction has reached its point in the market to do more. And I'm not going to repeat what my colleagues have already said. I think we've definitely got the point about it needs to be a blended finance approach. We need to work collaboratively. We need to be innovative about the finance mechanisms and instruments. And so that in itself is already something that we need to get right from a consistency side. I mean, we're already struggling with, on the climate side, understanding what, you know, sustainability-linked loan language in documents should look like. And so I also feel like the LMA needs to act a lot more aggressively in terms of that cooperation to ensure the scalability, the commonality amongst ourselves. So maybe working with us more and working through the Loan Market Association, because the money's there, and I think we've said that before, and there's appetite now to do it. But consistency is important. Nobody wants to be associated with putting money into something that actually claims good impact, but is not delivering the impact. I think that is the important point for me to emphasize.
Thank you. I like your last point, and probably it's really a key message for us. We don't want to claim a positive impact when we are actually not really doing that. No greenwashing, no calling it a nature-based solution when it's not actually nature-based solutions, no calling it an ecosystem-based program when it's not addressing those. So thank you very much. And before I will close, I want to invite Mustafa to come in and share.
Thank you, Charles. I have 2 minutes to conclude, to make my remarks. So I will be very brief, just to say that first, good morning and good afternoon to everyone. Just to say that maybe the most important takeaway we can have today is to say that we are the financier on board today, which was not the case a few years ago. I mean, the most important thing we need to congratulate ourselves is to recognize that now NBS is not anymore in a small box. I mean, the subject of few people working on it and convinced of that. But I think that now everyone is convinced about the importance and that we need to promote this approach. It's a new approach of making things and putting the nature in everything that we would like to invest. So this is, this is a big achievement. Now we have to put it concretely on the field. This is what's important. And we talk about a lot of conditions for that. We need to increase the capacities of people, of all actors. And for example, I can give you the case of one project we financed a few years ago in one country, and we can't find contractors, we can't find experts, local experts dealing with that. Even if we have the willingness of the clients motivated by doing something, but nobody can help him. And this is very important. So the capacity is key. The capacity, the knowledge is very important. We have also in IDFC, we finance about 30 billion euro this year on adaptation. We have 18 billion on biodiversity, and a lot of willingness to do that. But we need also to help them, and this is one of the role of the IDFC facility, is to help to facilitate the engagements of our national development banks. We heard about also the partnership, which is key also. We have a few forces around, and we need to work together and to try to avoid to have too many different initiatives replicating and maybe joining forces instead of dividing it. I think this is also one important issue. We also think think that private sector should be involved in one manner or another. Financial resources are also important. From the bank perspective, we talk about bonds. We need to have adequate resources, but also the instruments used to deliver this kind of projects. And this is also one initiative we have taken at IDFC level to launch a program with members, voluntary members, and DBSA is one of them, with the idea to first to increase the capacity of banks, of our clients, of our members, but also to other actors, because the banks cannot do the things alone. They need to have public entities also aware of that. We need to have actors, private sector also fully convinced, which is the case, but also capable of implementing. This is something important. The other thing which is important is also to create some kind of referentials, because the banks don't like to have too many kinds of technical things. They need to have a clear framework on which they can say that if I finance this project, is labeled, is for 100% sure it is nature-based solution projects. So we have to help them to put in place these standards, some kind of standards for banking industry, to ensure, to facilitate their engagement. So this is something important, to increase the knowledge, to increase the capacity, also to give some, because the banks like practice, like to invest things, so to give them also the financial instruments to implement it. And I think what we are doing is really very could complement what IDBs also launched this week. And we will be very willing to coordinate with all stakeholders, and in particular IDB in this case. I will stop here, and I thank you all to be here and for your engagement on that subject. Thank you.
Joint business opportunities. In the